And you're live.
We call this meeting of the task force to study the city's municipal election laws to order. All members of the task force are here and present. Thank you all for joining us tonight. The first order of business on our agenda is the minutes, but I actually don't believe, I know, Scott, I saw you had shared the minutes from the meeting on the 10th. Thank you for doing that. I'm not sure they've been shared with everybody. And I'm overdue in doing the ones from the 24th. So I don't know if
I sent the ones from the 10th to everybody.
Okay. So happy to entertain a motion if someone wants to approve the meeting minutes from the 10th. We'll have the ones from the 24th at the next meeting.
I move that the meeting minutes from the May 10th meeting be approved with any necessary corrections.
Great. Is there a second?
Seconded.
Great. All in favor? Aye. Great. Thank you so much. So, you know, I think we're waiting to see if Eileen Leahy from our Board of Elections is going to join us, as well as Regina Eldridge from our city clerk. But Jared, I think we'll turn to you. Thank you for joining us this evening. You know, Jared DeMoranis is the Division Director of Candidacy and Campaign Finance at the Maryland State Board of Elections. And as of a few days ago, congratulations, will be the next State Administrator of Elections, which is very
Thank you. Thank you. Yes.
Congratulations so much. Thank you for taking a few minutes out of your busy schedule to spend some time with us. I think just for your benefit, I'm not sure how much was shared with you, but right, we're a task force of citizens that's been impaneled with a 6-month time frame from our State Board of Elections to basically make recommendations to City Council about how we would, you know, come to a consensus around updating our city election code and sort of how elections are transpired here. So I guess I'm sort of just to kick it off. I'm sure everyone will have questions, jump in, and we'd love to hear sort of whatever you would like to say. But sort of with that lens, like, how do you look at sort of what might be happening here, what's happening in other places in the state that might give us sort of some thoughts about how we might make recommendations to update everything here in the city of Annapolis?
Well, I guess the first thing, I'm sorry, of course, like the sun is coming in at a weird time on my in here, so I apologize with that. If you bear with me 1 second here, I'll take care of the shade. So
It's all good.
much better. So, but I guess I'll be happy to kind of do this as more of a Q&A part here on everything to go forward with it. I think that the city has a good foundation. I mean, like, you've had all elections for a while here, but I think there needs to probably be some modernization of the code just as you want to move forward with it. Most notably, I think in campaign finance, I've mentioned this in the past to other people, you know, the code is, I would say, it doesn't really address political action committees, independent expenditures. It's basically the idea of just like candidates, you know, running on the ballot and not necessarily looking at more of a modern campaign. And, you know, the city of Annapolis is growing, and, you know, as it grows, more money interests come in. And as these projects come and become more and more valuable, you see it on the county level, you know, money is spent, and you need to have ways of making sure everyone discloses that activity in a clear manner, in a timely fashion, and then have sufficient penalties associated with that for failure to comply. Because if it's not sufficient, then you won't get compliance. I mean, as much as everyone wants to think that everyone's a great actor, it does help to have a stick attached to these things. And for the other portions of it, I think you talked about increasing voter turnout and those aspects. I remember the city of Rockville recently just did a all-mail ballot election, and it seemed that at that level there that there was at least somewhat of a jump in that. And in our COVID time period as well, when we had in the primary all mail ballots, we did see new voters participating for the first time because, I mean, it becomes easier for them to vote because it's just right there. It's like, oh, okay. So those are kind of, I would say, things that have been implemented, especially at a municipal level, that have been there. You know, I think you have multiple facilities, and we work in tandem with you know, the county. You work in tandem with the county, and the county works with us for the equipment and sites. I think that has been a good working relationship there. I think you also, I'm not sure if you mentioned about the fact trying to jump onto the state ballot, or at least I had that in one of the emails as well. So, you know, if you want to do that, you know, there are some other challenges involved in that, like, you know, whether or not you want to follow the same sort of rules with candidates. And I think other towns have kind of done that. And one of the things is the voter registration lists, of course, right? Some townships have different voter registration versus the state because of qualifications, and just making sure that those kind of, I would say, technical issues are worked out beforehand, and just go, you know, just making sure that they're there. Now, I believe other places in the state that run municipal elections, they run them concurrently at the time of state elections, but in different rooms. So it would be like, oh, here at this facility, this polling place is the state election going on, and then you have to walk across the street or walk across the hall to vote in the city election because you know, because it's a separate ballot and you have to check in again and everything else. And that wouldn't require state legislation. The other ones would have to probably require state legislation to implement. So just kind of, you know, I'm happy to answer any questions there. But that was kind of some of the bigger things there that to pull from other, I would say, municipalities.
That's great. Thank you so much. Questions? Everyone jump in. JM and then Scott.
Sorry, just to clear something up. There are the options would be, you know, getting on the state ballot and not having to cross the street to go to that other place, right? That's what you meant. Not
yes,
that...
exactly. Right.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean,
So...
right, you can get on our state, right, and then there would be some other, like, I would say, technical things like, you know, do certain rules that you would have to follow, like for candidates or anything, you know, making sure that they comply with other parts of state law.
The idea would be to update the city code to match the state code, and then we could be on your ballot.
Yes,
if it's at the same time, right?
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yes, kind of making sure that it's there. Right.
All right. Okay, I had misheard. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jarrett, for being here. I also want to say thank you. I've got a unique experience coming into this. I've been a former state campaign account treasurer and assistant treasurer. I've been a city campaign treasurer and then a city candidate. And I've actually years ago had phone calls with you when I needed guidance and found that your office and you in particular were incredibly helpful. And just, I don't know how many people realize how helpful your office has been to campaigns. So thank you for that. I really appreciate it. That experience serving as a campaign treasurer for both a state campaign account and a city campaign account actually causes my question. So one of the things that is incredibly difficult about the city campaign finance procedures, and I think this is becoming more difficult because campaigns are raising more money as the city's grown, and also as, you know, vote by mail forces campaigns to actually be more aggressive with mail technique. You can't just target your activity to one day of election, right? You've got to target it to a season of activity now. So that causes campaigns to be more expensive. Our campaign finance system is basically a PDF. that you fill out. And it requires a lot of manual thinking, particularly if you're looking at aggregate gift limits. The city has aggregate gift limits like the state does. And I remember how easy the state system was. And I used the former system when it was called Electrac. I think it's
Right.
different now, but it did some of the thinking for you. Like if you started to put in a check from a donor and they were going to go over their aggregate, it flashed a warning. So you knew it was coming up. Getting to my question, if we were to adopt state campaign finance law and take a position that we wanted to be on the state ballot and pursued that, could the city then leverage the campaign finance system that the state board is using, since we would have the same reporting cycle as the state offices and be on the same state ballot?
So I think that those were kind of like the things that legislatively we would have to be worked out. But yes, that was kind of like whether or not you come onto the ballot, that would be kind of one of the issues, which would be, are you going to then adopt the same campaign finance reporting system? Are you going to have electronic filings? Are you, allowing the state to kind of dictate issuing fines against the committees, right? So right now the counties, the state controls that. If you're a county candidate running for a county office, they don't issue the fines. I issue the fines. I go after those candidates. And this would be kind of I would say, part of the legislative process. If you move over there, it would be, now it's going to be, we would also adopt the cycle, the schedule, and, while your limits might be a lot less, we can probably talk about that because that can be changed and modified in the system. The other parts could, be, I would say, adopted. It's a flexible system because we did that for public. For example, we did that for public financing, right? Public financing has a completely separate registration type of activity and different limits with different flags. And then it just becomes a budgetary issue on, who pays what. And that's a different story, but it wouldn't, I would say technology wise, there is no impediment to that.
Okay. And if I heard you correctly, we could even potentially, I don't want to say this is a firm answer, but we could potentially even still retain our lower limits on what somebody could contribute to the account.
Yes, right.
I'll just say to my colleagues, having worked with both the city's PDF and the state system, that would solve most of the problems that I think Eileen spends a lot of time reviewing and doing bookkeeping on, because the system really is designed to be user-friendly for campaign treasurers who are volunteers. Thank you very much. That could be very helpful.
Thank you. Eileen?
I was going to say, Jared, I don't know if you remember that Cliff Myers looked into trying to hook onto the state system a couple of years ago. And basically, the vendor just said, no, you have to have your own system. It was going to be something like $300,000. And that didn't include maintenance necessarily. So we did look into a way to piggyback, but weren't able to. So if we could go into your system. Having said that, my understanding is that some of the technology is pretty old.
Yes.
And now that you're in the congratulations on your new promotion.
Thank
And
you.
I know I spoke with Brooke Learman one time about it, and I think it falls under her purview, but it would be great to know what some of the technology improvements are coming that may also impact our decision.
So right now, the current contract goes through to 2025. And after 2025, we're looking not necessarily to keep the system, but we're going to keep our options open. So, and I don't necessarily I can't discuss a lot of the procurement aspects of it, but, we are looking at making the system more user-friendly. Technology has changed dramatically. in its course. Just like I look at it kind of like phones. My iPhone, probably my original iPhone, wouldn't be able to be run today. And so like that, you always have to upgrade and change and adapt to make it as user friendly as possible. And that's what the goal will be moving forward. But still maintain, website, 24-hour access, all those other, current, features as well.
Great. Faye, and then Andrew, please.
Hello, thank you and congratulations. My question is there a possibility if we do not go on the state's ballot, but keep it separate, the election separate, is there still a possibility to use your financial system? Or would it have to be all inclusive, all encompassing?
I would say that would be through legislation, because that would be something that we would need to have access to, because right now there is legislation that requires municipal candidates to provide me, the state board, with copies of their reports, and we post it online. And that legislation would have to be changed, because we would then either create a portal or something like that for candidates to file or do something. And that would need to be, there would be budgetary problem, everything else that would need to be worked out. But other parts of it would have to be at least brought to the General Assembly's attention.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, Jared, for coming to speak to us. So on this theme of technological change, it seems like every major technological innovation causes problems in the ways that campaigns potentially use them. I think Eileen mentioned social media causing issues and whatnot. So the major technology that has come to fruition lately is ChatGPT and generative AI and that sort of thing. How do you foresee major challenges with that? And do you think those challenges require some sort of legislative action in the city code?
So I think that ChatGPT and AI just in general will, of course, bring new challenges. I mean, I think, just like social media initially, I think that there's going to be a lot of positive from it. And then everything like social media, then the evil comes afterwards. And then people start figuring out how to use it to, really spread some information. And I think this goes to the idea of spreading disinformation or malinformation. And I'm not necessarily not sure if code changes are needed, but there would be some sort of, for example, I used regulatory capabilities now to make sure that if a campaign uses a deep fake video, that they have to put on, not, how you have an authority line, which is paid for by or authority by, that in that authority line, it also has to say that this material was also, basically did not occur in reality. So there are things that I think that, yes, you can do. The use of bots, we went after that and said, if it's a bot, that it's campaign material. You can't just pretend that it is. And that they then have to also, if they start promulgating or disseminating messages, that it becomes more of sponsored by or, promoted, so that as a individual, this is not coming from that. And I think the AI technology would kind of fall into that. I am now looking into that for the state purposes as well, and how to kind of best regulate it. I know that there are parts about having watermarks on videos and everything, and embedding sort of code. There are things about the technological aspects of it that would get into the weeds, and I leave that for the real techies. I look at it going, how do I make sure that the voters are informed about what they're hearing and what they're seeing? And that to me is the more important part. And if you take a look at it from that perspective there, then you can kind of regulate it. And the other part too is it's very difficult because you are regulating speech. So you always have free speech to battle against. And you have to make sure that the governmental interest is defined and narrowly tailored. And which is why you can always go after candidates and making sure that it's a part of the authority line in there, because we have already have that that power currently. It gets further and further away when it's just an individual trying to post something or spread. But that kind of it is an issue, and there are parts of it that you're going to have to kind of look at and be very circumspect about how you draft it, because you are weighing into an area that will be, litigated. Sorry for the long-winded answer.
That's great. Thank you. JM, and then Eileen, if you have another question.
Sure. One of the things that we are investigating is the idea of unaffiliated positions, as in like the mayor would become an unaffiliated position, kind of also wrangling with the idea of what happens during a primary at that point. Do you have any words of wisdom for us there?
Yes. So that's basically a jungle primary is what they're called. And New Jersey, which is where I'm from, so I don't necessarily know. They have certain municipalities that run nonpartisan elections, and they're off cycle. They're completely themselves. And so what you have is basically a jungle primary means that everyone kind of will run. You may or may not want to put party designation next to their names. That's up to you, because it's supposed to be for everyone. So, sometimes municipalities or anything like that, they don't want to put their party designation next to it. Doesn't mean the candidate can't say that I'm the true Democrat, or I'm the true Republican, or I'm the true Green, or anything like that, because they are allowed to. It's basically the rule of, I like to call it 2+1. Basically, it's a vote for two, you have to have 3 candidates to run a primary. If not, you automatically go to the general. So you have to have like 1 extra office. So you would have a primary election, which would then narrow it down to 2 candidates for the general, and then from there it's just those 2 candidates. And then you have to make sure if you have a sore loser law or not, to prohibit anybody from attempting to get on the ballot. The interesting part about this with these types of elections is allows ballot access to almost anybody, because they would be able to go there. You don't have to necessarily think about non-principal or third parties trying to get onto the ballot for the general election, because now they would all be in the primary together in that process there. Additionally, all your voters then would be able to vote in that primary election, because it's a nonpartisan jungle-ish type of primary. So at that point there, people are making some decisions and feeling vested into it. Finally, when you get into the general, what you do have sometimes, in other states and everything else, the top 2 might be 2 Democrats, it might be 2 Republicans, it might be that. So you still, you get to the point where at the end of it, the winner in the general election will most likely achieve over a majority of the votes. Whereas sometimes if you have, multiple candidates, that you might not get that with a winner. You might have a person winning with 40% of the vote and 30 and so forth. But here you always have that. So that's just one method.
As a follow-up, is that a kind of a primary that the state would be able to run, a nonpartisan mayoral primary?
Well, I think that it would be off cycle. I don't think you can come on the ballot.
Okay.
Well,
I mean, we do have
that. Let me just say this:
positions.
that answer currently,
Okay.
but those are technical questions there.
So
Hop in, Scott, please.
the question I have, and I'm not trying to pin you down on this, but I guess I'm trying. Board of Education elections. don't they kind of run on a jungle primary system now on the state ballot?
Yes, I was just, when I was going back to that, it was just like very much like that type of aspect. But I don't necessarily know what nuances or different programming, because, like I said, but school board elections are kind of a nonpartisan, and with the 2+1 rule, and they have no party designation next to their name. So they run, but school board elections do have, like, on their campaign literature, they do mention their party affiliation, but it doesn't, it's not appearing on the ballot.
So would it be fair to say if we wanted a nonpartisan ballot and we want it to be on the state ballot, or managed by the county board as an extension of the state board, probably best to look at the Board of Education election process as what to mirror? Just because of some state.
At least it has that type of feel and qualities that we've already know how to run.
Thank you.
Great. Other questions for Jared while we have him?
I have one.
Good, Eileen.
Jared, one of the things that's come up with the with people that are interested in the nonpartisan is the effect of the Hatch Act that appears to bar federal employees from running for office. Our Office of Law had done some initial research into it and felt that there were, because Annapolis had such a high concentration of federal employees, that there might be an exemption. And I'm wondering if you have any
I wouldn't
information.
want to weigh in on that. That's definitely something with the Office of Special Counsel and their rules, and making sure that, whatever they need to do to go through that.
Okay, well, that would be helpful. Okay, thanks.
Great. Any questions? Anything come to mind? Great. Well, thank you so much for taking the time, Jared. We as we work through our process, we're about halfway through our 6-month charge here. So, I hope you don't mind if we end up following up with anything, as we'll want to pick your brain about something. But thank you so much for taking the time tonight, and congratulations again on your new appointment.
Thank you, and I appreciate that. And anytime, always trying to help. It is. I don't live in the city proper, but I go down a lot. I'm right outside of it, so Annapolis is very near and dear to me. Making sure that you guys have good quality elections as well. So happy to assist and move forward with it and offer any sort of counsel on the process. So anytime, and thank you again.
Thanks.
Bye.
Be delivered at the outside. The dog's going crazy. So, I think the other 2 items I put on the agenda are basically really trying to get some discussions around where we're going, as I just referenced. Jesus, we're at basically the halfway point of what we were set up to do. Obviously, we talked with Eileen. Other groups that have had a charter to do a set time, there is a chance Riley could go from there. But I think I definitely got the sense in our last conversation that, and the public hearing, right, that, we didn't see the response we were hoping for. I think, that first thing, that really what we have to work on is more community engagement, and then sort of plotting out the time, discussions of particular issues. Eileen and I talked about, some of the other groups have done sort of like an in-person work session that will allow some sort of really kind of debating of topics at some point later in the process. But I think I'm curious sort of what everyone's appetite are for those. We're also heading into the summer, right, where people are going to be traveling. And so starting to think through how to use the next 3 months, of whether we just keep the same meeting schedule or try to be a little more flexible. And then really this related issue of, after hearing from Jared, I think you saw the email with the feedback from Jim Peck from MML to the questions that we posed. Would we want to bring in, aside from feedback through some sort of survey instrument, to get feedback from folks in the community? are there other folks we'd want to bring in to invite in? And maybe that kicks off a conversation about where we go and sort of how to plot out the next couple months. Are there other folks who appear to like, who you think, oh, definitely need to get this person in to be able to ask some questions? Yeah, please, Andrew, just feel free to jump in. It's fine.
Sure, just thinking off the cuff here, I don't know, would we be interested in from the redistricting task force and about their experiences and about any aspects of that process that they think could be improved and whatnot? I don't know if it's, since they're like in the middle of it, it's kind of a sensitive time for them to be speaking about it, but I don't know, maybe inviting the chair of that task force to come speak with us might be worthwhile.
Aren't you on that, Scott?
No, I was not on. I
You're on
commented on it, but I wasn't on it.
Yeah, Jared, I mean, I'd be happy to ask Jared, but yeah, Eileen. You're on, Eileen.
You're muted.
Eileen, you're on mute.
I'm sorry. There's been talk about looking at word redistricting in terms of voting. I'm a little hesitant to bring it in at this point because their task force hasn't been approved yet. And I know at the Board of Supervisors of Elections, we've asked about it. We've been kind of waved off on it. And there's going to be some changes. It's not going to make well, it depends on how you view it in terms of a big thing, but it probably won't affect elections as it are. It would really affect elections if it went towards, say, if you made overlying wards or precincts for the city. And unless you're thinking about that, and I've read the report, so I don't see where they were looking at that. There has been discussion about saying 5 voting districts and then 2 people from outside. I mean, there've been lots of talk about that in the past, and it's been kind of, I think, viewed as different. The city council actually approves it. The report is out. It's very substantial. It does address the Voting Act. It doesn't. One of the things we also looked into that's an aside is if we need to start providing materials in another language. And based on the 2020 election, or based on the 2020 census, we don't hit the threshold for having to provide materials for elections. And in the past, when we've looked into it, we've been again waived off. Actually, Mark Rodriguez assisted us in 2017. And the challenge is you want to make sure, kind of like there's Australian English and British English, you have to be careful about translation. So we do provide a telephone number that people can get assistance. So anyway, I don't know if I've digressed too much from it, but if you haven't read the report, it's a really good report.
I'm not entirely sure redistricting is in scope for us. I mean, I do get how it's connected to elections, but I could also make the argument that redistricting a charter, and that our charter is really focused on getting on the ballot and the canvassing of the ballots, and how the elections are conducted, whereas redistricting feels like more of a structure of government issue, because it determines how the council is organized and divided. So I'll stop there. I had another comment, but just I'll pause in case there's any follow-up on the redistricting.
Andrew?
Yeah, I mean, I would, what I had in mind about looking at redistricting, I think it's less about kind of the mechanics of the voting and overlap with precincts and that sort of thing. It's more about making potentially a statement, recommendations related to the independence of the bodies, in this case, the task force that engages in redistricting. So to my understanding, they can make recommendations to the city council. The city council can, by law, completely ignore them, revise them in any way they want. and that sort of thing. So I do think that's like something that is worthwhile to look at, and it's something that is that structure where there's more independence and you have an empowered redistricting commission. I don't think is uncommon, and I think it's becoming less uncommon, if you will, around the country. So substantively, I do think it's important. So to Scott's point, whether or not it's in the scope of our remit, I think it's a fair comment. I would have to go back and look at the legislation that I guess created us, but I do think substantively it is something important and something that we should look at if in fact we have the authority to do that.
I mean, I definitely agree with the spirit of your comment, regardless of whether it's in scope or not. And I will tell you, it's compounded by, if you look at the competitiveness of our wards and the competitiveness of our elections and whether or not we draw candidates. I mean, here's the harsh reality. We're talking about like how a primary should be run. The reality is, if we look historically at elections in the city of Annapolis, if you have a 2+1 rule, most of your wards would not have a primary ever. Like, if you look at the last 4 elections, so
Only for mayor.
2009, 13, 17, and 21, on average, we don't draw more than 2 candidates per city council race. Like the average candidates drawn to a city council race is 1.8, because we either have a candidate or we have 2 candidates. It's like a third of them are completely unopposed. And then it's made worse. I'll probably speak more freely than I should here. When you look at the specific wards that are the least competitive and how that correlates to the redistricting process, District 3 and District 4, or Ward 3 and Ward 4, were incredibly outspoken about maintaining their wards as is. Ward 4 had to have Bates. Ward 3 was, the alderwoman was fairly adamant that the ward should not be touched. It should be kept intact. They're the least competitive wards. Ward 4 hasn't had a competitive general election in the last 4 elections. Ward 3 had 1, and 2 of the last 4 elections only drew 1 candidate completely. So that, I mean, there is some interplay there that I think we should discuss. And that really does build me into the, like, I would like to see us start tackling in depth the nonpartisan elections sooner rather than later. Because it's a lot, it's about, I don't even think it's the nonpartisan election. I think I'd like to frame it about the role of parties in the city of Annapolis's electoral system. Because the code is very much based on this premise: you're either a Republican or you're a Democrat. And I mean, we've talked about this. The registration numbers don't bear that out. In fact, if you looked, I think Democrat, Republican, others now outnumber Republicans. Now, other is unaffiliated and all the tiny third parties
Yep.
that are out there. And I mean, it drops off, but when you clump all of them together as other, that's the second largest group. But there are lots of ways it shows up in the code. If you're in that other category, you can't serve on the Board of Supervisors of Elections. Like you're specifically prohibited from it. You have to be affiliated with a major party or an other party, the way the code is written. Ballot access is another, when I say ballot access, I mean the ability to get your name on the ballot. It's a completely different standard. I mean, I will say, I thought it was kind of silly that, like, I wrote a check for $60 and I was guaranteed ballot access because I was a Republican. And I assume that the premise is that if you win your primary, that's your means of showing that you have broad basis support to be on the ballot. But if I had tried to run as an unaffiliated, I would have had to go around and collect signatures on a petition to get onto the ballot to demonstrate a broad basis of support. And I've heard people say, like, what happens if we have too many candidates? But that's a far cry from today's reality. Like, if we doubled the number of candidates, it would still be a very manageable number. But so anyway, that's a long-winded way of saying, like, I think we've heard a lot about parties and elections, and I think it's time to just dive into a work session and start talking about it.
I think that's makes sense to me, and that's probably where we start, right? Is the first sort of substantive issue to get into. I think on the issue of the redistricting, and like, I mean, I've talked to Debbie, to Andrew's point, I've talked to Jared a little bit about that, about his process there. I think Yeah, I mean, I think it couldn't hurt to bring him in just because he has a guy who has perspective on a variety of things in the city. I think it would be interesting to your point of like, how do you, because this is the dynamic we're going to have and he's having now, which is the council, you know, the report's been delivered and has not been taken up, right? So it's like, how do you land the plane once you come out with the recommendations would be interesting to see where his head is right now about that. I'd also think it would be interesting to see from him, you know, in the context of doing the redistricting, did you hear from people who were talking about things that are actually in our purview, but were brought to you, and sort of how do you think about that? And he's a very thoughtful guy and would probably do that. So I'm happy to, if there's interest in that, reach out to him and see if he's available the next time we meet to just do a few minutes and talk about that. So just on that thread, are there other folks that we think we want to invite, or to Scott's point, like, do we feel like we're getting to the point where we want to really start amongst ourselves, sort of digging into issues and seeing sort of where people feel like they are?
Yeah, no, Scott basically gave word to everything I was going to say.
Cool. Cool. Okay, so I posed before that, you know, Eileen mentioned, I think in the context of the Charter Review Commission, there was sort of an in-person, you know, which is available to us to basically actually sit in a room and sort of discuss issues and, you know, in a public setting, and that people could come in. Eileen, if you want to talk about that a little bit, I'm curious sort of what everyone's appetite for that is, and maybe secondarily when that might make some sense.
Yeah, what we did was we had a work session over at Pip Moyer. Now, there were 12 of us, and we had subcommittees. So what we had done was subcommittees had done the research separately, and then at the work session really was kind of a shared information session, and then started really whittling down to some basics and basic topics, which, you know, could be in terms of looking at this overall code and what areas to start with and looking at some of the priorities. A work session is a public, the public is allowed to attend, but they cannot give testimony and they can't comment. What we did was we took notes, not minutes. So the minutes really just, there really weren't, I don't think we actually had minutes. We just had a notation that the meeting was available. It was not available on Zoom. It was only available in person over at Pip Moyer. We did, I think it was 3 hours. We did it from 3 to 6 o'clock. Had snacks, took a break, you know, that sort of thing. But at least from the Charter Revision Commission, I think we found it really helpful because we were able just to kind of come in person and talk it out and then come up with really some basic, you know, avenues to look at. I mean, it was a typical, you know, white paper stuck on the, you know, stuck on the walls and that sort of thing, really kind of a strategic planning type of thing, but it was very helpful. Particularly, we did it pretty close to when at the end of our 6 months and used it mostly for putting together our report. But I think in hindsight, most of us would have liked to have done another one earlier in the course of things. And we can work with, Hillary can work with us in terms of setting something like that up.
How does that sit with everybody? Is there interest in that sooner rather than later versus sort of, I guess, you know?
Sooner is good.
Yeah, I would agree. That sounds like a great approach.
Cool. So we'll between Eileen and I. Yep, Mark.
Mr. Chair, just a point of information. Be aware that if you do meet in person, it will not be video recorded. So that's just one downside to it.
Sure.
So there would need to be minutes taken. We just don't have the cameras and microphones and that sort of thing set up in Pip Moyer. So
Thank you. No, to totally understand the trade-offs, I guess. So okay, so Mark, what's our next scheduled one is what, the 25th at this point? Is that right? Let me look at it.
yes, the 28th
28th.
at 6 o'clock.
So I guess the question really would be, do we do another one on Zoom, see if we can get Jared Littman, and then really see how it goes to take on this issue of sort of partisan, nonpartisan, and debate it in this context? Or do we want to basically say, let's try and do that one the next time we meet in person, whatever works for people's schedules, and see how it goes in the room and see what other issues we might get into. I guess I'm curious what people's appetite is.
I think
If they-
we,
yeah, please.
yeah, I think we try to do the in-person for the next meeting and just start, getting at the issues so that we can at least see us making some progress. And get something down on paper. And I mean, there may be some other issues that we'll have
Exactly.
time for at that meeting as well.
Okay, Eileen, and then Andrew.
Yeah, I'd just like to recommend maybe, besides just the nonpartisan, to really start looking at some of the other priority
Right.
areas. One being, the Board of Elections is really going to need some guidance in terms of how to conduct the next election in 2025. So for instance, we did the all mail-in under the guise of COVID, but there are a lot of the current state board is doing kind of the absentee ballot version where everybody gets well, I shouldn't say that. If you've said that you want all mail-in, you'll get a mail-in ballot. But if you haven't stated that, you can request a absentee ballot to send in. And our current schedule is not set up to do that. So we really need to look at what type of election is going to be held next. Is it going to follow what the state does? Which actually was a question I thought afterwards with Jared to ask, because for instance, I've opted to get mail-in with the state, but that doesn't mean I'm going to get a mail-in for the city. And that's going to be confusing for voters because they may be waiting. They may be saying, I'm not voting in person this year. I'm going to get my mail-in, and then they want to know where it is. So that's another area that really needs to be looked at, because if we do opt in like what the state does, we need to move our primary to either May or June, and that'll be a big change, and that will really affect the election code. So I think there's some other areas that might be helpful to split up, and you all, may just have certain issues. The finance laws also is another one that really needs to somewhat be sooner than later. So, and some of that may be driven if we meet in person next time and do a work session in January, we hopefully will maybe get us some feedback on the survey that we'll talk about in a few minutes. And that might help also.
Thank you. Andrew, go ahead.
As a process suggestion, I think Eileen has suggestions, Scott has suggestions, everybody has kind of suggestions what to talk about. So maybe prior to that work session, we can kind of just compile a comprehensive list. Like everybody can send their points of discussion that they want to bring up, and maybe to Regina, because I know we can't send it as a group or discuss it as a group because of Open Meeting Act requirements, but maybe just have sort of a central one person that receives those points that members want to have discussed at the meeting, and then we'll distribute that beforehand, and then at the work session we can try to start going through and tackling them all, so we're not focused just on one. We're not focused just on a handful of issues, because I think we'll have those, like the points that the members are interested in, and then once we send out the survey that Eileen mentioned, we're probably going to generate a few more. So I think the sooner we get to tackling them, the better.
You read my mind, Andrew. That's exactly. So I think just for the purposes so we can be on the same page, feel free to send those to me, and I'll sort of put them together and share them with Regina in advance, and then we'll have them as part of the agenda that comes back. Scott?
I really was going to, Andrew kind of made the point I was going to make. The only thing that I'd add is we may want to be thoughtful about how we rank the discussion points, because some resolve others, right? Like if one of the discussions is, do we want to move to the state ballot? That probably resolves a number of the other issues. And so just thinking about the relationships between them, but mostly it was the point that Andrew made.
I totally agree, right? Like once we have the list, then we'll see that, there's some that close other doors or open other doors. So I think that makes sense how to go through it. So yeah, so please do that. Eileen and I will get with Hillary and Regina about the availability at Pitt Moyer, and sort of what we need to do be in compliance as much as we can. We may then have to, based on that, come back and talk about dates, but ideally probably that week, I would think. We'll see what sort of people's availability is, and we can do that by email and sort of follow up and see what sort of windows are available if they can put it together for that one. So I think that sounds like a great first step, and sort of being able to sort of have that list of things we want to get into and see what we can get through. So thank you, everybody. That's great. So the other item I have here, other than is really about the communications piece, and I know Eileen and Faye and Andrew have been talking a little bit about sort of the idea that we talked about last time about sort of a subgroup to try to figure out how to collect more feedback in the community and try to figure out how to get in front of folks in the community to talk about that this thing is happening, so people are aware, and hopefully we'll elicit more response. So I guess sort of Eileen, if you want to talk a little bit about what's maybe in the works with the city staff and how sort of for everyone's benefit, that would be super helpful.
Okay. So I talked with Mitchell Stevenson, who is the PR information person for the city, and I have to write my notes. She suggested doing an all digital campaign utilizing geofencing and Google Facebook Age to target Annapolis residents to complete a survey about local elections. Incentives was something that she also suggested, because that can increase your response rate. She recommends that the survey would be 10 questions or less, would have limited options for answers, and then you could have a comment section with limited characters at the end of it. The survey could be, so this would be a survey that would pop up, say, on people's Facebook pages, and they could answer it on their device or on their phones. And again, I'm not a tech person, but my understanding is with the geofencing, we can put the parameters in terms of, the city boundaries. That doesn't mean that everybody that responds is necessarily a city resident or necessarily a registered voter. So if someone is in the city of Annapolis and they see this ad and they want to answer the survey, they can answer the survey. She said the link could also be disseminated via social media and other sources such as community organizations, newsletters, and inserts. She has found that social media is really not having as big effect as it's had in the past, and most of it is targeted towards older respondents. But she did think that it was worthwhile to consider. She would say we would probably need to get a budget request for $1,000. As far as I know, we don't have a budget, but we could certainly ask for that. So what we could do is put the survey up, run it for say 2 weeks, and that would be the digital campaign, but it also would be on the website. So we could, mail out information to the different community organizations, churches, whoever we want to send it to, and say, please go to the survey on the website and answer it. It's not as clean or as direct, but we could be driving people to the survey. We could also use social media through her office to promote that. She would be available to assist us with the survey, except as her time has been very busy with the new garage and with the 4th of July coming up, and of course with the challenges in Ward 7 with the shooting recently. She suggested she and I went over kind of a tentative timeline, which would mean if the task force tonight wanted us to move forward with it, Andrew, Day, and I are scheduled to meet tomorrow, so we could come up with a little bit more in terms of survey questions to disseminate to the group. Look at having final approval from the task force on the survey at our next meeting, and she would also assist us with doing some testing of the survey. And then after the 4th of July, launch it, have it run for 14 days, and then collect the data during August or early August, end of July, and put it together. She did stress that this is not a scientific survey. This is just kind of really to test the waters, to get some feedback. But my thought it was just that it at least would give us some information and at least get people thinking about it. They could still, people could still file comments on the website if they wanted to give more information to the survey, but I think if we can drive people to the website, that might be helpful. So that's what I have from her. Like I said, looking at survey questions, Andrew, Faye, and I have kind of thrown a few around, and we'll meet to go over that more, and certainly whatever the other task force members think that are important to put in, but it gets tough with 10. So, Andrew, Faye, do you want to add anything to that?
Not really. I actually had a question, Eileen. So obviously when folks make comments to submit comments to the city council and stuff, they have to put their name, address, that sort of thing. Did Mitchell say anything about requirements related to that? Like, will we be asking, are we required to ask about names, addresses in the survey itself? Or
I can ask her more specifically. I don't think we would gather that in doing the geofencing and the ads. We could request it more on the website. I mean, the form does ask for that. You could ask on the survey, for instance, are you a resident of the city of Annapolis? Or more specifically, just say, what ward are you in? So if someone doesn't know what ward they are, it may mean that they really aren't a city resident. So we get a lot of people in 214, 01, 03, and 09 that say they're city residents. Does that answer your question? Okay.
I was gonna say, it sounds like a great place to start. So thank you all for sort of meeting and doing this. And I think maybe the list of topics we're going to have for the work session might inform the 10 questions that we want to get. So as you know, if any of you sort of have thoughts on that, maybe sooner rather than later in this next 2 weeks, then we can sort of share that with the folks who are working on this and see if that helps round out the questions. But my guess is there's probably more than 10 questions that we would be interested in. So it'll be interesting to see how to land that. But I think, once it would be live in that format, then I think like we've had some conversations about like sort of, who in the community, whether it's different, sort of civic organizations or whatever, be able to say, this thing's live now, you should, share it with your members and see if we can increase some attention there in that period where, so I think everything, it seems like a good approach. Thank you.
Is the group okay with us moving forward then? I don't know
Yeah,
if we need
any
to have a
other-
motion for that or not.
I don't know if we technically need one, but unless anyone has any objections for the three of you spending more time to work on this project, I think it sounds great, but I'm curious.
Well, we should have something to present at the next meeting.
Great. Sounds good. Great. The only other item I had on my list, which was not on the agenda, was I know Eileen, you sent out an email with some responses from the county after questions that were raised last time. I think that it came in yesterday or the day before. I just wanted to make sure if anyone had a chance to look at it or any questions that it might provoke or answer. Just wanted to be able to have time to chat about it if people want to. Scott?
I just, so looking at his response, the one thing that I just find funny is their lack of willingness to commit on a nonpartisan election when the Board of Education elections are nonpartisan. I wonder if we shouldn't write back with a more pointed, if it was structured to be exactly the same as the Anne Arundel County Board of Education is elected, would your answer be more clear? I wonder sometimes if we're just overthinking the whole nonpartisan election on the state ballot thing, because it does exist.
We could ask him. I think David tends to be very tentative about it because it really comes up to what his board and what the state says. I think actually Jared probably gave us the most information in terms of how it could run with the Board of Education. Also, the idea of going into another room and having a separate ballot in a separate place was interesting too.
it made me, I can't remember whether he said it was Rockville, but it almost made me want to ask, what their turnout rate was compared to their state election turnout rate at the same time, to see if people actually do go across the hall or across the street to the other room, or whether there's like significant drop off.
I don't think it was Rockville, but he used that as the example of moving to all mail, right? But
Oh, that's right. That's what they were.
Rockville
I wondered where it was.
Rockville kept theirs separate, but they went to an all mail-in even before COVID. And they had very low turnout rates, like 16%. And they did see a marked increase when they went to mail-in. They have a bigger population than we do, I believe. I mean, I can certainly send something to David if you want something more clear, if you send me what you'd like to.
No, I think you're probably right that his answer, Jared's answer today probably was all the clarity we need, that if we really want to do it and we want to be on the state ballot or have the county or state board run it, likely need to look at the Board of Education as the model and tie close to that.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I mean, my takeaway from his comments too is like, you could probably do most anything you would want to do, but you got to go to the legislature for it, right? So like that's
Right.
so like in some ways the conversation has been, how do we refer things to the city council that they can change? And one of the things they would have to do is on all these things we might want to recommend, they have to then go to the legislature for it, which so to Eileen's earlier question about 25 and what happens when the cycle starts for 25, like that adds a whole nother time element, right? But
I mean, the challenge with having to go for legislation and also just going to the board is that they're set up by political parties. So that's the challenge. Right now, the Board of Elections at the county has recently changed. And so the new chair is a Democrat. Trudy McPhail is the new board chair. So you'd have to get it through those two groups. So it would be interesting to see how open they were about it. I've been a little surprised that the city council does appear to at least more interested. The current group is more interested than past groups in terms of at least learning about it. But again, I guess one of the things that has come up at the Board of Elections is really focusing on the voter. What is the best thing for the voter? What is going to be in terms of communication, access, and consistency for the voter? And that's been kind of a focus that we've had. So, but again, if you're going to do big changes, it's probably better to do them all at once than to try to spread them out too much.
yep.
I just,
Any
my,
other-
my gut
Please.
is that the campaign finance issue is going to get worse. Like we had 3 city council candidates raise over 40,000, I think, in the last election. And my gut is that number is going to grow. Because if you have mail-in voting or early voting of any form, I mean, the reality is a simple election on election day can be very efficient because you can drive. I mean, you used to hear about the old 72-hour campaigns, right? You could drive all your activity to one day and one decision point because it was one moment in time. And when you've got to be top of mind for a voter now for a week or 2 weeks or however long they're out, it just encourages you to do more to stay top of mind, which will cost more. And I think the campaign finance stuff is we're probably at a place where it's about to tip into really hard to manage.
Well, and if you're bringing in, if you're, talking about unaffiliated candidates, they're going to get crushed. It's really, yes, you have to get ballots to get on the ballot. You have to get 100 signatures. But to me, that's attainable, but trying to compete for the money for an unaffiliated candidate is difficult.
I mean, I will tell you my experience, and I mean, obviously, and you have experience too. My number one fundraising source was my Christmas card list. Like, I mean, municipal elections, it tends to be, I actually did a look at who donated to my campaign. I had just as many Democrats donate to my campaign as Republicans. And it was people who just I knew personally or knew from work or I don't
totally agree with you, Scott. There's no reason an unaffiliated candidate with a big Christmas card list could be competitive just as well as anyone else, right? Like I think if you
But
went
to his
that,
point, people are raising more money. We had 2 candidates using Act Blue.
Yeah. no, but that's
I mean, that's
sort of a generational component that's going to, I mean, that's sort of how campaigns are being run. It's sort of the at the higher levels, it makes sense. It's filtering down with some people, right? But like,
Well,
that could
that
be the
and
norm.
also groups like Emily's List and other groups like that are looking for specific candidates that they can support.
Yeah.
So that's another factor. I mean, Mr. Peck talks about it doesn't take a Democrat or a Republican to fill a pothole. And that's I've heard that many times, but the reality is there's a lot of politics even at the municipal level. Just take a look at the fact that the Board of Elections was sued for putting in mail-in ballots. I mean, that was a political,
Yep.
action, and that's just the reality. So we are just a municipality, but we're 40,000 people. And I think we have more, I think this past election showed me that there was a lot more affecting us than we realized. And I don't think it's going to get easier.
I think that makes a lot of sense. Great. So we've exhausted what we had on the agenda. Any other sort of comments or questions, or anyone want to jump in on anything? And I think we have a plan for the next one. Andrew?
Yeah, Ian, I think you had a good point in one of your last emails about talking about like the process for making determinations about what recommendations we include in the final report. And it sounds like we're starting to get to the point with this work session where we're going to be narrowing down, at least like eliminating some. So do you have like anything in mind about how that process will work, or do you want to hold off until we get a little bit closer?
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious sort of what other people's thoughts are. Like, I mean, I like the idea of doing this sort of in-person work session sooner rather than later. You know what I mean? And then knowing we can do it again later, depending what. So I'm hopeful we can do this, before the end of the month, which then will allow us to sort of plot out what comes after that based on what progress we make, right? So but I'm curious. I think we need some sort of roadmap like that. I'm not sure I have it very fleshed out in my head, but I just I can envision a scenario where we're sort of discussing different items, and then it's like, are we taking sort of are people basically saying, let's do that, right? Are we having voting sessions? Are we having how are we going to get through this so it complies with what we need to do from the public facing point of view, but also actually get progress, right? So it's not just, so I guess I feel like it's something we need to figure out, and I'm not sure I have the answer yet, but it's kind of front of mind.
I mean, ultimately, we're just making recommendations, though, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I was just going to make a recommendation, either, to do it the work session or another time. If you haven't already, just read the code, read the charter, and read section 4 for elections thoroughly. I talked to Ashley this week, and she's going to try to tackle looking at the code and trying to identify what varies from the state using the new summary guide from 2022. And I think I sent that guide out to you all as resources, but I think if we can really look at that, and that may be something even to do as one of the things in the work session, is just go through it. And so when we did an ad hoc committee a few years ago after the 2013 election, that was helpful because many of us didn't really understand how the pieces fit together. And as Scott was saying, you do one thing and it will affect the others. There actually is a draft. I don't know if it can be shared or not, but there actually was a draft that was put out a couple of years ago for a nonpartisan election, and it's actually draft legislation, and it's interesting to look at. But again, it doesn't have some of the nuances that have been established since then. So, but again, please look at the code, go through it, ask questions, and maybe that would be worthwhile, at least get something out to you all beforehand. And then also look at the ward redistricting task force report, because it is interesting in terms of how certain criteria need to be met for the voting rights.
Yeah, well, I'll make sure we send that out to everybody. Andrew, please.
One comment, one question. In terms of the comment, I think perhaps perhaps the best way, this is just a suggestion, perhaps the best way to go about when there is a recommendation and perhaps we're unanimous and it just goes forward and it's easy. If there's some sort of split, maybe, and I think the legislation that set us up said we use Robert's rules, right? So it'd just be based on a motion seconded and then like majority vote or something like that. So I think that might be the simplest way to go about it. But you know, from our discussions, it sounds like a lot of us are aligned in a lot of ways. So I don't imagine too many differences of opinion, but you know, you never know.
Yeah.
In terms of and I think Eileen's point reinforces a point made by Scott earlier that we probably want to order, once we send all our points of discussion to Ian, we probably want to order those carefully, because I think one suggestion was we just scrap the city code entirely and then use the state code, right? So I don't know if we decide to do that, then how deep we want to get into the state code, or excuse me, into the city code. I'm not sure, but maybe Eileen, there's something I'm missing. Like, do you think we should go into the city code even if we decide to decide to recommend moving to the state code? Or
I think it's worthwhile to look at, and I think it's worthwhile to look at the state code and see if there's certain things at the state level where like, maybe the state likes it, but maybe we don't, because there are a lot of kind of nuances for the city. And there are certain things that people might like. I mean, so I think that to have an understanding of both, I think to understand what we currently are we going to try to rewrite and kind of do renovations or a restoration of the code, or are we going to go and buy a new house kind of thing? But again, I think we need to know also what the state is saying, so that, and if we could do a side by side like we've done in the past, I think that might be helpful for the group. So you could see what the alternate would be. You know, and again, it was good to hear. Yeah, it was good to hear from Jared to say that there could be some changes, like the limits, because the limits for the state are much higher for candidates. Also, in terms of things like recount, I mean, there's processes that they have that we don't have, but want to make sure that what their process is what we want to have in the city. So I'll see if we can get that to you all before the next meeting.
I would just say, like, you know, I guess the thing I'm sort of thinking about, and I'll clear this with Regina and stuff in advance of the public hearing, but like, I know the council has sort of weird rules about what you can and can't do in a work session versus what you have to do in a public session, which would probably be, the work session will still be open to the public, but do we have to take formal votes on things here, which can be disseminated to the public or whatever? Like, I mean, sort of whatever criteria they're using to show public facing, I think, you know, we'd probably want to get an answer to that before we sort of, but yeah, I mean, in general, right? Discuss topics in an order that makes sense, because if you close certain doors, then you don't have to discuss others. And then, you know, very, very quickly through debate, figure out where people are at and then figure out how we can officially vote on them so we can sort of move forward. It's definitely my interest.
Yeah, I was just gonna add that when we have this first work session, I don't think we should take votes on anything, because I think that we should get an idea of where the task force stands. But I think we still want to take into consideration what the public input is through those surveys, because if we're not going to take into consideration, then we shouldn't do them at all. That's why I don't think we should vote at the session, but I think that there should be a process when we get to that point.
Yeah, and I think like there's probably a step in here in between once we start figuring out what we think we might recommend and how we formally take those positions amongst ourselves, and with the public input comes in, and then there's probably, here are some sort of draft recommendations, right, before we're finalized, that you can sort of sound out people onto, right? Like, and which would probably create a whole nother phase of public input, right? So like, I mean, we can decide how based on how much time we have and how quickly it goes, right, to decide what those steps are. But I'm a proponent of, you know, right, more public input, the better, right? So like, it's always easier for people to, you know, having been a member of the city council, for people to basically, you know, be sort of targeting what you say you want to do versus sort of, you know, tell us what we should do, right? So, you know, and I mean, maybe we do that at our own risk, but I think it makes some sense to be like, here's where we think we're headed, and see see how people respond to that before it's a locked report. And, you know, I mean, we talked about this earlier. Well, you know, Jan's point is right. Like at the end of the day, we make the recommendation of 5 citizens of what we think is right. And then, you know, it goes. But, you know, the dynamic that we were talking about the redistricting committee that has been in limbo even after their report is done for a long time is like, I'm cognizant of that. Of like, you know, if we're going to decide we think with all the input we take that we think this is worth, you know, I'd like to see the council do it. So like, how do we figure like from my perspective, that's like the second phase, right, of this thing after we're done. But that's just maybe my bias. But yeah, I mean, I think, you know, if we're going to put all the work and time into it, we want to hopefully advocate for it and make people see the reason why we came to the recommendation we can't.
So we should plan on, for the June 28th meeting, we should be planning on, is it going to be more like a 3-hour session, that sort of thing?
I think if we can find the time that works for everybody to actually get people in a room, I mean, my instinct would be to go, you know, a little bit longer to see, you know, how we can go. So I think that makes sense if that's sort of what Eileen, you know, this has been done with other groups that's similar. I'm for that, unless anyone has a reason not to.
So you want to do the work session on the 28th?
Well, let's
would
see,
meet-
I mean, let's see if we can, yeah. But
We have a
is
meeting
everyone-
that day. So if you have a meeting and invited, say, Jared and talk some more about
Yep,
plans for the work session, I don't think you could do both. It's either a
gotcha.
meeting or a work session. And I'm also thinking for the 28th, we want to get approval for the task force. So I guess I'm just wondering if we,
See, this is where we.
for the 28th is a meeting and shoot for a work session shortly after it, or I can ask if we can do a work session, but that's got to be, if you do a meeting, we have to be doing video.
I think we said earlier, Eileen, that we would go with the work session.
Yeah,
on
let's
that
do the
day,
work
and then
session.
if
We can
need
say
to-
Jared for the next meeting. But yeah, if you think,
I mean, that's fine. I just wanted to
Yeah.
clarify that we had also talked about doing some things,
yeah, the approving whatever
right?
comes from Mitchell.
Well, let's talk and even see what's available both at Pip Moyer and talk with Regina and see what's possible.
Okay, that sounds good. I'm happy to join you and talk to them and see what we can do. And then we'll,
Is everybody available to be
On
in
the
person
28th?
on the 28th?
Yes.
great. Thank you, everybody. We'll definitely be following up by sort of email shortly once we get some feedback from the folks at City Hall about that, I think. Does anyone else have any other comments for the good of the order? Great. We'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
For a second.
Seconded.
All in favor? Aye.